And I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing, but I also haven't edited one of the new setting ones yet.
Right.
Because we've been doing them so fast, I'm actually behind. Believe it or not. Okay, just gotta delete that, and... Alright, we're rolling for real.
For real. Okay.
Alright, buddy, how you doing today?
Good. How are you doing, man?
I'm alright. It seems like we have everything functioning this time, so
Yeah.
we can get into it. It is the 18th of February.
18th of February.
12:39 p.m.
12:39. And what we talking about today, man?
It's a little bit earlier than usual. Today, you want to talk about Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, we were going to talk about that because that's one of the topics we wanted to cover for a while.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk about this for a while for a number of reasons.
Totally.
I think one of the most important ones is that it, in terms of both my political and sort of intellectual development as far as argument goes, which, as you know, is a really important aspect of how I think about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to get into that in another pod, I promise. Mm-hmm. We've hashed out what the pods are going to be.
Yeah, I know. We know what we're going to do now. It's limited availability.
Totally.
No vacancies.
But in the Israel-Palestine conversation,
man,
we're both going to talk about the actual conflict itself and sort of geopolitical perspectives within that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also really important to talk about the argument as a whole, and what I've learned about argument from it, what I've learned about the actual arguments that are presented
man,
in and around that conflict.
Definitely. So maybe starting when kind of with this idea of it being really formative for you growing up. Like, how did you begin learning about it?
Great question.
Yeah.
So one of my earliest memories of this issue is when I was really young.
Yeah.
There were... Careful with that. When I was really young, there were a couple newspapers that were left behind, that were just old newspapers that I had in my room for some reason.
Oh, okay.
That my parents, my parents had saved them at some point, and they gotten incorporated with the stuff, and I found them at some point and was like, "Can I have these old newspapers?"
Right.
And unfortunately, they've been lost to time at this point.
Right.
But one of them had a really distinctive picture on the front of an Israeli tank, and then a Palestinian boy throwing a rock at it.
Right.
So that was in... that would have been just after I moved to the States, because I remember the house that it was in Ballackinwood.
Right.
Right beside the university. And that sort of started my first interaction with that conversation.
Yeah. That image stuck in your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. And there were two papers, and both of them are really distinctive. One of them has that image on it, and the article is obviously about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
And the other one was of an Egyptian sarcophagus.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So they're both really distinctive in totally different ways.
Absolutely.
So that sort of triggered my recognition of this event in the world, and I probably asked a couple preliminary questions about it, and I read the article.
Right.
What's interesting about the timing of that is in England, I don't think I was exposed to any Jewish people.
Right.
Or at least not aware.
Yeah.
Not with any level of awareness.
Right.
But where we lived in the U.S., in Philadelphia on the main line, there's a lot of Jewish people. There's a big Jewish community.
Absolutely.
And of course, you lived in New York.
Yes.
Which has one of the largest Jewish communities.
Absolutely.
In the world, period.
Definitely.
Outside of Israel, I think it's the largest.
I think so. I think it is. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and of course, Israel and conversations about Israel are fundamentally entwined with the Jewish people and with Jewish identity.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
So that sort of, that's my earliest memory about it, I believe. And then at the same time, I was starting to interact with Jewish people
Right.
and started to learn that there was a real division
Yeah.
in the way that people saw this conflict.
Right.
For people who were almost always within the same sort of chunk of the political spectrum.
Right.
So on almost all big divisive issues,
Yeah.
you see sort of division across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
You see people going to the left and people going to the right.
Right,
So
yeah.
at the same time I'm learning about Israel-Palestine, I'm also learning about left and right. I'm
Yeah,
also learning about politics.
Yeah.
So it sort of interacts with all of these concepts, and they're all sort of
Totally.
piled in there.
Totally. And this particular issue of Israel-Palestine, you said, kind of stands out in all of that.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's a
not
sore thumb.
following the golden rule of being either one or the other, depending on where you fall on the spectrum.
Most things typically, they kind of,
Right.
especially these big sort of moral issues,
Yeah,
they typically fall on either sides of
for sure.
a sharp divide. So how about you, buddy? What was your first exposure to?
I was probably learning a little later. I remember I learned a little bit about it before high school, and then in high school, I really sort of spent the time learning about it. Mr. Blair's politics class, to be honest. Yeah, it
An
was
essential class?
Yeah,
Yes.
very important class in a lot of ways, because we went through the history of the conflict. And to be fair, I don't think I've studied as much as you, but a lot of what I learned from it after that class was through very, very kind of radical left-wing Jewish student groups that I went to at Oberlin. And these were people who were, doing crazy stuff, like, which I liked. I thought it was really kind of cool and subversive, but they would go on their birthright and then they'd leave the beaten path. They'd go off the beaten path and then go and like work for, radical Jewish Palestine solidarity organizations, but they just leave the train, as it were, and just go off on their own, which was kind of cool. So I began learning about some of their experiences and what they talked about. But that was a little later on than kind of your engagement with it, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
Have you ever gotten into an argument with somebody on the other side?
Oh yeah,
of this issue?
absolutely, absolutely. I remember first year I got into an argument with somebody on the first side, and I don't remember the exact details of it because it was late. It was just a very passing argument, and during the first week of school. But I do remember it just being very ideologically driven. And I just remember having to be like, okay, let's take a step back from this. And, I respectfully try to disagree with you on this one, but I was pushing buttons,
Right.
And
how many times do you think you've encountered that argument? Have you engaged in it?
Not too much sort of, explicitly, like a few times. I think I've wandered into it a few times. But more I've just kind of taken a step back from that and seen it play out, online or in articles or in media and things like that. So,
Totally.
Not too many times actually engaging with it in person, but more just kind of observing it. But you've probably engaged with it directly a lot more, because I remember you doing it in high school. Like, I remember you talking to people in high school about it. And so you had like a bit more of a repertoire about, okay, how do I approach this kind of thing?
Totally. I would argue, it was always such a fascinating issue for me, and I would argue quite actively with people about it. Because in part I was trying to figure out what was going on for them.
Yeah.
Because people you agree with on almost every other point.
Right.
And then there's this thing that to you seems like it is out of left park. It is sort of against their other beliefs.
Totally, yeah.
And that was fascinating to me because not only in terms of argument, but also in terms of just sort of introspection.
Yeah.
Because, maybe if that's how it appears to you,
Yeah.
could be that that's how it is for you.
Right.
And they're actually in alignment, and you're sort of thrown out of whack.
Yeah.
A lot of my early intellectual development was about trying to get my ducks in a row and make pieces of the world fit together.
Totally, yeah.
So that was why I think I was drawn to the issue.
Yeah.
And it was something that you could find people to argue about, and
very easily.
Very easily. And a lot of people would be willing, and they would also, the arguments often were emotionally driven.
Yeah.
But there was a real, and I've hit it against for multiple people at different points, who I didn't know very well under other circumstances.
Totally.
There seems to be a real feeling within the Jewish community that they should engage and have this argument.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating to me, and something that I feel like, regardless of their position in the argument itself, is something that should be expanded to many different topics for many different people.
For sure, absolutely.
This willingness to get involved.
We should talk about this sort of thing. We should deal with it, you know?
Definitely.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So that sort of added another layer to the intellectual development that occurred.
For sure.
So before we dive in, because I want to, we can do a little bit, like we don't really disagree on this, we can't argue with it directly.
No.
We can sort of talk about argument.
Yeah.
But I guess one of the easy ways to start is to talk about Israeli history.
Sure.
And what your sort of knowledge of how Israel came to be.
There's a lot of gaps in it for me.
Totally.
So I kind of, after World War II, decolonization in action, set aside a chunk of land for the Jewish people. A lot of them go there.
Yeah, there's a lot of gaps there. Right?
Yeah, there's a lot of gaps there.
It's okay, buddy. Keep going,
A lot of the people do end up going there. And then I remember that basically it's not recognized by the surrounding states.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a big war in
1948.
1948, yeah, exactly. And a lot of, and that's where kind of the U.S. gets involved and sends aid to Israel at that time, sends weapons and things like that. But the Israelis have to kind of defend against these multiple fronts at once.
Right.
Yeah.
The Israelis refer to it as the War of Independence.
Right.
So that's a good sort of frame.
Yeah.
I'm going to fill in a couple holes.
For sure. Thank you.
I should have read my article I wrote about it a while back, so it would be super crisp. But let's just start with. Let's not jump all the way back to the Bible yet. Let's just start with Zionism. So at the turn of the 20th century, there's an emerging train of thought within certain sections of the Jewish people that says that we should try and return to Israel.
Right.
This is a matter of debate within that community. And it's not until about the turn of the 20th century that people actually start doing it.
Right.
And the way that they start doing it is they start purchasing land in the region and moving there. And they start to set up little communities. At the same time, there's these two parallel pieces of thought that bizarrely collide in early Israel, and that is essential for understanding the vast peculiarity of the state that emerges.
Right.
And on the one hand, it's Zionism.
Yeah.
And then the other hand, it's the communist revolutionary movements.
Right. Yeah.
That are emerging in places like Russia. Which are famous for these terrible pogroms and suppression.
Absolutely.
That are taking people and making them go, we should try and figure out a new way to do things.
Right.
We should figure out a communal way to do things.
Right.
So this overlaps in the Jewish community.
Right.
And you get a combination of these more hardcore, full-on sort of more closer to what we would think as a modern Zionist, a more right-wing type of person, combining with these more left-wing sort of progressive.
Yeah, that's fascinaking.
Yeah. Isn't that remarkable?
Absolutely.
And that kind of sort of goes further on into history to explain this weirdness that we started with at the very beginning, where this set of ideas somehow ends up in this group of people where you wouldn't quite expect it.
Right.
So this collision between these two lines of thought, this revolutionary communism and this Zionism, they both align really well on Israel.
Right.
Because both the Zionists and the communists see the purpose of going to this place, purchasing land and trying to set up a self-sustaining...
Figuring out different ways to be in community with one another.
Exactly.
Yeah, as a people.
For the first extent, and of course there's also a small indigenous Jewish population there still.
Right.
That that is given varying importance depending on which side of the
Totally.
Argument you're on. Based on my knowledge, the first attack by the local Arab population
Right.
Occurs in either the 20s or the 30s.
Okay.
There's a notorious sort of massacre which seems to start the exchange of violence then.
Right.
I can't remember the name of it. But one of the big results of it is that up until then, the Jewish settlers have been organized in a number of different ways.
Yeah.
But they haven't actually sort of founded a defensive military force.
Right.
So in response to these attacks, they found an organization known as Haganah.
Okay.
And Haganah is the root of Haganah. It combines with other what you would now call terrorist organizations that emerge during British occupation.
Okay.
That all in turn turn into the modern Israeli Defense Force.
Right.
So that
The seeds of that come from
Exactly.
this period of time before the war. Okay.
So at that point, you now have what are essentially, after the Haganah is formed and the soon-to-be Israeli, soonish to be Israelis, the Jewish settlers there start to defend themselves.
Right.
Then there starts to be a real division between the Arab population and the Jewish population.
I see. Okay.
The Jewish population is still a huge minority.
Right.
Right? So the formation of a state is a big question mark.
Yeah.
Right? So under when the British take over the region
Right.
and then control it as mandatory Palestine,
Right.
there still is a substantial Jewish minority population.
Right.
And one of the things that they do is they request for when the British leave
Okay.
for an Israeli state to be created there.
Okay.
But there's huge debate about the extent to which the state should be.
How big it should be, right?
How big it should be.
Yeah, that's a big one.
How much it should control, who is in it and who is not in it.
Right.
And this is really important because who is in it and who is not in it is just about one of the most key topics in all of Israeli politics.
Completely.
Right?
Completely.
And we'll go into that when we hit the more
well,
modern
it makes
side of
sense, right? Because if you have a majority Arab population living in the region, but you want to create a Jewish state, you want to create an area, if that's your goal to create a Jewish state, you need to kind of have those
You have to create a
boundaries
totalitarian state, but you have a bunch of communists and leftist people, and you're working with the USA that hates communists.
No, exactly. And you have to, but you also have to make sure that the area that you do create is mostly Jewish.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So this is where we do some fast forward. We're too much about each individual segment of history. So we can try and keep this a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
But 1948 is a huge year because as you said, this is the year when basically the surrounding Arab countries are like, this is a problem. Basically, what happens is the British leave, and they don't really figure out how to partition the place.
Totally.
They're trying to come up with an agreement. There's this United Nations project to try and figure out an agreement that works for both sides. Mm-hmm. It's the first of many United Nations projects in this region that are abysmal failure. Right. They leave. The situation is a huge question mark.
Right.
And at this point, structured military that defends the Jewish portion of Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, they realize that this is their moment, and they stake their claims. And they produce a written declaration of independence, and they say, this is our constitution, and we are going to run our own state here. At which point, of course, the local Palestinian government, which is Palestinian government, there's the local Palestinian structure is incredibly limited, and doesn't have a fraction really of the organization or let alone the military power of the Jewish population,
Right.
despite being a majority.
Totally.
What it does have is lots of Arab countries around it who are fairly more organized, though not as organized as you might expect.
No, absolutely.
And do have militaries.
Right.
So they essentially, are in conversation with these surrounding states,
Right.
and the surrounding states decide that since there is this Jewish population
Totally.
there, it's time to go and kill them.
Totally.
It's time to get them out of there. They've declared a country. They're not having any of that.
Right. It's time for them to go.
That leads to the War of 1948.
Okay.
In the War of 1948, this is where one of the two fundamental aspects of sort of Israeli identity is born.
Right.
And that is, oh my God, we are under threat
Yeah.
from everybody around us.
Absolutely.
And then very quickly, the second aspect is born, which is, wow, we are undefeatable.
Yeah.
Right? Because the War of 1948 is really this one incredibly key moment where the Israeli people win ridiculous, like they're actually fighting against the odds.
Right.
They're at a huge disadvantage.
Right.
And they win sort of remarkable battles, and they outmaneuver, and they use their resources far better,
Right.
and they lose a fraction of the casualties of the other sides.
Right.
They basically outthink and out-strategize their opponents on each front, and they defeat all of the surrounding states.
Absolutely. So you could see how, in terms of creating a mythology of a people and a mythology of a country, that those actions during the war, the underdog, the David and Goliath story, the, sort of military cult around the militarization, that all feeds into a kind of cultural idea of what it means to be an Israeli.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
So you have these two remarkable forces.
Yeah.
This fear.
Yeah.
Of being under threat from everybody around
Right.
you, combined
Siege
with
mentality. Yeah.
combined with this feeling of being incredibly powerful.
Right.
Right. And that sort of resonates throughout the culture.
Right.
And even though at this point, arguably the fear is unfounded.
Yeah.
Israel's by far the most powerful country in that entire section of the world.
Absolutely.
Despite being very small.
Yeah.
There are a few things that could, in theory, undermine that.
Right.
It's one of the reasons why Israel aggressively murders Iranian nuclear scientists, is because their fear of getting hit by a nuke is disproportionately huge.
Right.
Because they are such a tiny country, it would take very little
Right.
in terms of nuclear power to destroy them.
Right.
But in terms of conventional warfare, they have the best weaponry.
Well, they have the best weapons.
They also have an arsenal of nuclear weapons themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
That feeling of risk but invulnerability
Right.
is very peculiar to engage with at this
Right.
point.
But it's still almost embedded in the kind of cultural DNA of the place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
there's 2 years that I think are really vital. The first is 48 and the second one is 67.
Okay. So what happens to
67. 69 is the Six Day War,
Oh, okay.
which you've heard of.
Yes. Yes.
The 6 Day War is the moment where basically up until 67, you have 48 to 67.
Right.
You have a stretch where it's really hard to tell. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me hit the one last incredibly
sure.
vital point about
For
48 first. After 1948,
Right.
within the boundaries of the Israeli state,
Yeah.
there are now, for the first time in the history of the region,
Yeah.
in the modern history of the region, more Jews than other
Right.
people.
Right.
Right. So they've claimed a
huge.
majority population.
Exactly.
And in terms of their government, this is obviously essential.
Right.
Right.
It's a Jewish state now.
It now can be a Jewish state
exactly.
and a democratic Jewish state.
Right. Exactly. You can elect Jewish people
Right.
to your government.
You can elect Jewish people, and you can try and set up a state that maintains that.
Right.
And that is at the basis of so much of what is at the Jewish state, down to the way people are appointed to the Knesset,
Right.
which is their legal body,
Right.
sort of almost every aspect of how the state works. You've heard of birthright.
Yeah.
Why do you think birthright exists? It's to bring Jews into Israel.
Yeah, exactly. Create those bonds, those familial bonds,
and to maintain a political majority.
Exactly.
So, fast forward down to 1967.
Right.
Between 1967 and 1948, there were border skirmishes between Israel and the surrounding countries,
Right.
but there is no major conflict.
Right.
That means that the last memory for those people is this war where they legitimately had real threat.
Right.
And managed to overcome serious odds.
And defended themselves effectively. Yeah.
Right. Cue the 6 Day War.
Right.
The 6 Day War is basically and here is where obviously divisions in the conversation start to really emerge.
Right.
I think most people, most Zionists, if that's what we're going to call them, would have agreed with my narrative so far.
Right.
In 1967, the 6 Day War, it's a huge Israeli preemptive strike against what they see as gathering forces specifically on the Egyptian border.
Right.
And they go in and they destroy a whole bunch of stuff, and then that provokes the surrounding countries,
right,
who, under the Israeli interpretation, are of course already prepared to invade, and they've simply triggered that movement.
Right.
And there's tanks that come in from Syria, they're obliterated. It's an incredibly quick engagement.
Right.
It occurs very quickly, almost entirely due to the fact that Israel has overwhelming air superiority in the region.
Right.
And after the 6th, it's over.
Right.
Right. And now the reason I think this is such a vital date is because it's flipped the script.
Right.
Right. Now Israel's clearly this country that has all the power in the region.
Right.
They've beaten all of their surrounding enemies once again, and they've done it in a flash.
Right.
And they were never under any real threat.
Right.
Or they were under tremendous threat. And it was only because
because they're such good warriors, they use their resources properly, and they're defending their homeland. They've God on their side.
And this is why I think the 6th Day War is the moment.
Right.
Because it sort of epitomizes that conflict.
Right.
When you're having a discussion about Israel-Palestine and you start digging into history with somebody, the moment where you have division, you don't really have that much division on 1948. You just kind of talk about what happened.
Right.
There are things that you can talk about, like the extent, like how it happened that after this war there was suddenly a majority of Jewish people in the region. Ooh, that's a question mark. Why are there so many Palestinians leaving? Did they all flee? Were they killed?
Yeah.
There's all that stuff that you can get into.
Right.
But 69 is that 7-year war. It's a huge division.
Right.
I really hope it's 69. That number's engraved in my brain.
Yeah, it's probably 69. Yeah.
It's definitely right around there.
Okay.
Oh no, please. Like 10 times.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be there.
We're not gonna check. We'll just
go with it.
If I'm wrong, forgive me.
That's okay.
So that moment,
just
essential. I feel like it epitomizes the entire sort of intellectual disconnect.
Yeah.
Are we the best? Are we the worst?
Well, and then
are we the best? Are we incredibly vulnerable?
Right.
Indestructible, vulnerable.
Exactly. Yeah. And you could see how if you're thinking on one line of that, the kind of warriorship sort of mythology about being indestructible, about constantly having to defend yourself but overcoming the odds, you could see how every single subsequent conflict could be interpreted and form a narrative stream as a result of that leads us to where we are now with the conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So let us set up sort of why people argue about this.
Yeah, totally.
And then I think, if it's okay, I will spend the last section of this pod giving you what I think is the absolute clinic.
Yeah, totally.
On how to do this argument.
Let's do it.
Because a huge amount of it just comes down to making sure there's actually a disagreement.
Yeah.
Which is the hardest bit.
Yeah.
Most people they jump in, it gets emotionally entangled, it all blows up.
Yeah. exactly. You want to make sure you have something to argue about.
You want to make sure you're actually in disagreement.
Yeah, exactly.
So the reason people argue about this now, the reason it's such a divisive issue,
Right.
Is basically because the structure, give me the, you can do it. Give me the words that the leftists call the Israeli state. Tell me their criticisms.
So they say it's apartheid.
Yeah.
They say it's an Israeli apartheid.
Yeah, give me more. You got more?
So yeah, absolutely. Of terms they use, or just more about that?
What they say, all of it.
So, Palestine is an open-air prison.
Yep.
People there are second-class citizens, reminiscent of apartheid. Their water's cut off, their power's cut off, and they can be killed indiscriminately by Israeli forces. In the same way that kind of, in a way that's not dissimilar to how minorities here are targeted by police for things they don't do. Over there, Palestinians can get killed for things they don't do.
Yep. There you go.
Yeah.
That's basically.
I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, you've heard all of those things.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there are two major regions in Israel which the Palestinians occupy. Those are Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank.
And the West Bank, exactly, on the other side.
The things that really bug people on the left is there's two aspects to it, I think.
Right.
One is just raw military aggression.
Yeah.
They see these Israeli operations, these military operations, where there's some perceived threat to the Israeli population.
Right.
And then the Israeli military sends in tanks, they kill a bunch of people, and then they come back.
Yeah.
Right? All, as the Israeli military claims that what they're doing is preventing bad things from happening.
Killing terrorists, preventing,
But people on the left point out that it keeps happening.
Yeah.
So obviously they're not doing a great job.
No, exactly.
We're going to touch on them very gently. There are two intifadas.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard that term.
Yeah.
Those were basically Palestinian uprisings within Israel.
Right.
They were basically limited to a set of sort of terrorist style attacks on Jewish people, on the Israeli populace, and both of them resulted in large clampdowns from the military.
Right.
They also resulted in the peace accords.
Yes.
Which we're not really going to get into because I don't think they really managed to get anywhere.
Right. There was a big Camp David, like with Bill Clinton.
Exactly, that's Oslo.
Yeah.
There was a big hope at the time.
Yeah,
that would go somewhere.
It was big. It was.
I think based on how it is there now,
it didn't pan out so well.
It's disqualified itself from getting too deep into the discussion.
Right.
We could talk about politics within Palestine. This is stuff that I think is interesting and that we can chat about. The division between the two parties. The West Bank is actually under control of a different Palestinian party than the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. The Gaza Strip party is more extremist. The Gaza Strip is typically where, if you've heard about rockets being launched, that's where it comes from.
Exactly.
All of this stuff, I think, is good and worthwhile talking about, but in the proper argument that I'm trying to set up that you should have at the end of this conversation in the clinic.
Right. The clinic.
I think you managed to just avoid almost all of that.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go too deep.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Cool. But I thought it was worthwhile to bring up.
We can reference it. So
exactly.
You kind of are really. You studied this for a while. You know what's going on. And we're establishing that all these other things that people talk about.
Pretty much.
And you follow them.
I've heard of that stuff.
Yeah, but I've heard about it. Not in the same detail as you, but I kind of, it's if you turn on the news, you're able to sort of dig into this and what's going on.
So we were talking about the two different things general categories of things that leftists bring up, and we just basically talked about violence.
Right.
The violence of the Israelis towards the Palestinians.
Right.
The easiest number to bring up here is that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 4 times as many Palestinians have died as Israelis.
Right.
You're welcome to go fact check that at home. But that's the ratio.
Right.
That means that the Israeli idea that they are under threat is a curious one to leftists observing.
Right.
Because it seems like the more Palestinians are dying,
Yeah.
why is it that Israel is the one that is seen as under threat?
Right.
And we'll touch on that.
Totally.
The other section, so that's in terms of pure violence.
Pure violence, yeah.
The other section is purely the differences in status between Israelis and Palestinians.
Right, second-class citizens, apartheid, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That comes from essentially there is essentially a legal division in Israel. If you've seen Israel-Palestine on a map, then you've seen a region that looks like it is divided in two.
Right.
This is both legal fiction and sort of legal fact.
Right.
Because on the one hand, there is no second country there, that is only Israel.
Right.
Israel controls this entire region.
Right.
It is theirs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they have divided the region into different zones.
Right.
The zones are A, B, and C. They're not named very prettily. Basically, there is the Jewish majority. You can think of it as a full rights population.
Right.
But again, I'm touching into my own biases there, obviously. Right. And then there are these two other zones that are basically Palestinian zones.
Right.
And these Palestinian zones are sort of the worst, most dangerous Palestinian zones, and then intermediate buffer zones between A and C, I think. They named them in ways that makes it difficult to
totally
to remember which is which.
Totally.
Right.
But the general idea being that what kind of region you live in determines what kind of access to rights and amenities you have.
In very explicit ways.
Yeah.
So the most basic examples of these are my mother went to Israel at some point, and she noticed this.
Cool, I didn't know that. Yeah.
It's visceral.
Yeah.
It's the highways. It's access to transportation. Right. And this is something that you hear in Palestine a lot. If you're in the West Bank, your closest decent hospital is almost always going to be Israeli.
Right. Wow.
In order to get there, you have to get onto an Israeli highway.
Right.
This is a remarkably large problem.
Right.
It can take hours and hours because you have to go through checkpoint after checkpoint.
Right.
In order to get out of your zone, your bad zone, into the intermediate zone, and then actually into the good zone. Right.
And you might not make it there, right?
And you might not make it there if you've got to. And you, regardless of not being able to make it there, you have to pass military checkpoints at each point.
Right.
And you have to have the proper papers.
Totally.
So if you don't have the proper papers, it doesn't matter if so-and-so is dying in the back seat.
Right. You're not going to let you in.
You're not going to get let in. But even if you manage to get papers, you manage to see a doctor, they manage to diagnose you, they may say you have to come here at this time, and then you have all those papers, you still have to go through a huge rigmarole just to get from your home to the place.
Right.
The last part of this sort of legal structure and the way it sort of interacts with the landscape is in terms of what internationally is referred to as Israeli colonialism,
right?
Which is where they are building settlements in the West Bank.
Yes, and this is another topic that keeps coming up. And the phrase that gets thrown around is this is illegal under international law. That's the kind of phrase I've heard come up when people talk about this.
Yes, this is fascinating,
kind of interesting to me because,
and to me, totally useless.
Yeah.
The funny part is, for some of this stuff, it may even be illegal under Israeli law.
Right.
The political situation in Israel is fascinating for so many reasons.
Right.
In part because, in my opinion, the courts in general, we talked about this before, courts in general are about 30 years behind in a progressive nation. So in U.S. and Canada, their morality is sort of stuck 30 years ago.
Right.
That's kind of a rough estimate. That's kind of how I feel.
No, that's fair. Okay.
In Israel, it's almost the reverse. The Supreme Court in Israel is a remarkably progressive institution for the country that it's in. And it's very hard to see if that's just because Israel is so incredibly conservative now.
And so the court stands out.
And so the court is somehow standing out just for following legal process. Or there's some greater mystery there that I have yet to delve into.
Right.
But in terms of this structure, the West Bank. Darn it, I lost my train. Where was I, buddy? Remind me.
So we were talking about these kind of... I think we were sort of setting up your clinic, if I'm not mistaken. We're setting this up basically on the two... the two main areas for that the leftists sort of hone in on when they're talking about this. And that's the violence, and then you're setting up a bit of the context for the actual division of citizenship, you know, whether you're a full rights citizen based on this region or second class citizen based on where you live. And the way you're describing it, because your mom noticed this, was transportation and getting in between the zones.
Transportation is one of the most basic things.
Yeah, water I know is another one. Access to water.
Yes, part of the nature of the zones is they're not arbitrarily made. They're made in order to entrap and limit the movement of populations.
Right.
So
absolutely,
that's why something like the highways are such an important example, is because there will be highways going from a Jewish settlement or just it's such a weird lingo, but going from one place that may be in the West Bank, sort of, kind of, to another place that may be over here.
Right.
And they will just pass over Palestinian towns.
Right.
And those towns will have no access route to the highway.
Right. Wow.
Because we forget that if you don't have a road that goes onto the highway, you can't get on the highway.
Nope, you can't.
So there's basic stuff like that, and that though I think those are the two chunks that leftists take at, because they're just so clear and they seem to them to be very obvious examples of injustice.
Right.
And so they're trying to their whole approach, the leftist argument, is to try and take these examples of injustice, and you show them the people.
Look at it. Look at it, exactly.
And that is, my experience, not a great path to take.
Yeah.
In part because in a lot of the times leftists aren't people who have been to Israel.
Right.
They don't understand how obvious the division is.
Right.
If you come back from Israel and you've seen these things happen, you've seen the highways, you've seen the division in the society, and you're talking to a leftist and you're still not convinced that that's a problem, you're so many miles away
from having a meaningful impact on this discussion.
Addressing it in that way is a huge issue.
Right.
So this kind of brings up a question mark.
Yeah. So what's the question for you? What do you see as like the way to deal with this kind of? If showing people the injustice isn't the best approach, what is, or what's a better approach?
So the most important thing
Yeah.
is to avoid anything that looks like a direct attack on the Israeli state.
Yeah.
Remember that duality of consciousness.
Right.
If you show up and you're all like, I'm going to attack the Israeli state, you automatically trigger that combination.
Yeah, people are triggered and they want to defend the Israeli state.
Exactly.
Intellectually.
Right.
Absolutely.
What you have to do is you have to reframe the conversation in terms of Israeli politics.
Right.
Right. Because a fundamental aspect of a democracy is the ability to have a fair and equal conversation about politics.
And in a true democracy, there's going to be dissenting voices that are not oppressed, that get their word out. That's something I heard as well, something that helped me personally when talking about the conflict with people is, bringing up whether they're friends or organizations that are Jewish, that are involved in Israel directly, that align with kind of my political ideas on it. So I'm saying, like, listen, I'm not just coming at you as an outsider. I'm actually sort of looking and doing research into organizations that are already there doing work in Israel. I don't want to come across as, someone on the outside without a good idea of what's going on, just attacking.
Yeah. This political angle is really vital, because it allows you to sidestep huge chunks of what's going on. Yeah. Because the huge issue with the way in which so much of the argument occurs in these arguments is that the Zionists, whatever you want to call them, They're arguing from a position that they will not tell you.
Yeah.
Most of them. Right? And that position is Israel was given by God to the Jewish people.
Right.
You sit down and have a conversation with most Israeli, most Jewish people who are pro-Israel in the conventional sense. They're not going to tell you that Israel was given by God to the Jewish people.
No, they won't.
But it's there.
Yeah.
It's just a basic aspect of how they argue.
Right.
Of how they're interacting with your concepts.
Right.
Right? They'll give you sort of reasons why that are close to that. They'll sort of they'll talk about all these different ways in which Israel is special. They'll try to make a case for Israel being special and different.
Yeah.
But most of them aren't just going to come out and be like, God says it's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So what they have to do in argument is a very interesting structure. It's one of the reasons I want to talk to you about it.
Sure.
Because they can't go to this point.
Right.
Which is what you're trying to get at too.
Right.
You basically just want to be like, you think Israel is God-given. That's ridiculous.
Right.
But if they don't go there, you can't do that.
Right.
Right. What they do instead is they approach it the same way we just discussed about.
Right.
They'll give arguments that kind of imply that,
right,
but don't really say it.
Yeah, they don't want to outwardly
and
say
if you confront them on that, they'll immediately just jump back to some other argument.
Right.
They're not going to admit it, most of them.
Right.
So what they do instead is they jump sideways. They jump parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They'll leap parallel into another topic.
Right.
They'll bring up another thing. It creates this sort of like layer on layer on layer.
Right.
Right. That's why there's so many of these issues that we talked about today,
right,
and that we talk about in general. You've
right.
heard so many of them.
Yeah.
You've heard all of these different pieces before.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Because
that's fascinating, yeah.
People are always moving sideways on this topic.
And then the left, or the people who critique those always move sideways along with them.
And they always scoot around the circle with them.
Right.
Because they see another thing, and they always... Because the leftists have counter-arguments to all of these things. Yeah. But it doesn't matter because you're not hitting the root.
Yeah.
You're just going round and round in circles.
Exactly.
And this is an experience I've had so many times when arguing about this.
Yeah.
You just feel like you're going in circle after circle after circle.
Yeah, it reminds me of a fight where you're constantly circling your opponent, but there's no resolution to it,
Right.
Yeah, there's nobody taking an actual blow that's gonna evolve the fight into something else. You're not hitting anybody below the knees to take him to the ground, as it were.
Right.
You're just constantly dancing.
You're just constantly dancing in circles.
Yeah.
And it's
a good way to look at it. Yeah.
It's something that took me forever to figure out that was happening when I was engaged in these discussions.
Totally.
And to be fair, there are people who don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to rule that out.
No, absolutely.
But almost always when you're having a productive conversation with people who don't do this,
right,
it's because you end up talking about the actual politics of the country.
Right.
You're talking about how bad Benjamin Netanyahu is.
Yeah, exactly.
This dude's really evil.
Which he is.
Yeah. Like if you can move into a discussion, like there's nothing. Even only the craziest of people are genuinely going to try and move into a direction where they're saying that Benjamin Netanyahu's God-given to Israel.
Yeah.
Like, that is just too much of a leap.
Yeah. Right? There's enough Israeli people who see him as the insane megalomaniac that he is.
He's a democratically elected leader.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you can attack within the process, right, you can say, Benjamin Netanyahu's a really bad dude.
Yeah.
The things that he is doing with the country are bad.
Right.
And then obviously, that's a small piece of the puzzle. So the question is how you get from there to actually approaching the overall critique.
Yeah, definitely.
And the answer to that is that you start with those touch points in politics.
Right.
With the issues within Israeli politics.
Right.
I don't think I've ever talked to somebody who had a knowledge of Israeli politics who didn't think there was something flawed with Israeli politics.
No, totally.
But that is also an issue, I think, that goes for almost all political systems.
Exactly.
You are choosing to fight in a place where you feel like it's very easy to find common ground.
Right.
Right?
Totally.
From there, you can talk about how you feel, how you think.
Right.
That the structures that exist in Israel, structures of power in Israel, directly influence how people ended up voting for this sort of guy.
Right.
And the structures of power that are things like the military.
Right.
It's things like this legal difference in people.
Right.
It's things like the fact that this narrative of being under threat and of attacking and of being under threat, that feeds into an ideology, into a belief of the way the world is, that makes you want to vote for someone like Benjamin Netanyahu.
Give these structures form through your chosen politician.
And that, obviously, that's not the be-all, end-all of the conversation.
No, of course.
But that's a point in a conversation I feel is ridiculously hard to make any progress in.
Yeah.
If you can get people in a point, which seems relatively easy, where they don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is a great guy, where they think he's got a lot of issues, and you can then sort of start trying to explain how you feel like these systems of power in Israel have fed into creating this sort of political person.
Yeah.
Then you've really sort of started to shift the conversation to a productive place.
It's a good approach because you're inviting people who genuinely care about the state of Israel on a pathway towards a discussion about making it better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not engaged, you cannot get wrapped into any of this crap about it, whether or not Israel should or should not exist.
No.
If you're talking about, these aspects of, Israeli politics, if you're talking about how to make the country better, exactly, then all of a sudden you've managed to give enough common ground that you feel like you might actually be able to
talk to
somebody and have a resolution.
Absolutely.
This is why, I said earlier something about the words aren't quite coming to me, but I'll try and wrap it in. If you talk to somebody like this, if you engage somebody in this way, you give an opportunity to just totally evade that entire issue with the jumping parallel.
Yeah.
Right? You ignore the aspect of the God-given state.
Right.
And that sort of opens you up to this place where all of a sudden you can criticize aspects of Israel.
Right.
Without falling into those traps.
Right.
If you can always just bring things back to this solid point, then they can't jump parallel around.
We're having a political discussion here.
Exactly.
Helping people feel like they're not under attack or they don't have to defend this idea of Israel itself is really key. Yeah. Well, that's a really cool idea. So, you took me to the clinic, man. I like it. That was helpful.
I hope that I'm probably going to. This topic is endlessly fascinating.
Yeah,
to me.
Totally.
There's so much more we could chat about, but some of the people who have been really even very Zionist, have been people I've cared about a lot.
Totally, yeah.
And then there's a whole spectrum of that coming in,
right?
To much less Zionist, but that was it. I said at the beginning that it was important to figure out if there was any actual disagreement. Yeah. And that's a huge part of it. If you can make very quickly, the way you're discussing is the tremendous political struggles within Israel. Yeah. And sort of questioning how they came to be. Right. And whether or not these different parts of the conflict with the Palestinian people might have informed that and produced this really nasty guy who's in charge of the country forever now. Totally. Then you can just jump around like a huge amount of the conversation.
Yeah, and get to figure out whether you actually do disagree about Israeli politics. Like, if you can find that, we both are really unhappy with Netanyahu, we can talk about him in a similar way, then we can get somewhere, Exactly. Versus, do we actually disagree about him as a political figure? Right. That's a whole different conversation.
and if you've done that jump, but you feel like there was conflict on the way there. Yeah. One of the things I think that's super cool that you can do is you can trace your own path back to the person a little bit. Right. You can be like, look, this is how I'm thinking about it. Yeah. this is how I'm engaging with this topic.
Yeah, here's how I came to this idea.
This is the experience that I have.
Right.
Even something explaining how you feel a lot of the time when you're talking,
right.
that people are using this idea of Israel
right.
as the God-given country.
Right.
And, you're not God. I'm not God.
No.
I think it's pretty unlikely that Israel is the God-given country. I think it's pretty unlikely that there's any country on the face of the earth
absolutely.
that God cares about or gives.
Definitely.
But I also don't think that for a real conflict, for a real issue where real people are dying,
right.
real people are getting hurt, there is any value whatsoever in running around in circles after people who may or may not believe that Israel is a God-given country.
And you if you do believe in God, one of the big things that sets God apart from humans is humans are fallible creatures, so any kind of state that we create, whether it's here, whether it's there, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be full of human error in it. And if we can just
let's talk about that error.
Let's talk about that error. Exactly. Well, that's a really cool approach. And I guess to kind of begin to wrap it up. You found it. No, that's good. Yeah. No. We knew we were gonna go a little longer with this one, which is good. And it's been obviously successful for you, right? Yeah. So it's worked in a lot, and it's worked in a way that you wanted it to work, and maybe helped you in your conversations with the people you care about, or just want to talk to you about this. Help you sidestep that endless dance that so many of us fall into.
Totally.
Yeah, that's great.
It's helped me hugely intellectually. There's a couple times where I've had conversations with these people, and I felt like I've actually, at some point in the future, they've talked to me again and be like, well, you sort of managed to make a difference in how I was thinking about this.
Totally. And you mentioned you wrote an article. Were you writing about this kind of process of how to argue or how to have a conversation with people?
That article, I was actually just attempting. I'd had one of these conversations at one point, and we'd ended up touching on a lot of different pieces of history.
Right.
And I wanted to do a bit of research and really make sure my history was on lock.
Oh, okay. So it's, yeah.
Unfortunately, that was a couple of years ago now, so the things. Oh God, it's gonna make me so sad if that date is wrong.
The 1969 date. Okay, but
don't say it.
We'll go with it. Yeah. I'm sure it's right. I'm sure you got it.
Thank you, buddy.
No problem. Well, I was thinking because it might be, we're gonna probably. I think the next discussion we should have is about your project and your ideas around communication and argumentation more generally, because I think this really naturally just feeds into that conversation, because you're almost talking about like coming up with the geography of how to argue about this issue, giving people a map about, hey, here's how to talk about this thing, or my opinions on how to talk about this thing, which I think is really cool. I think that's something we kind of come back to a lot is, people talk a lot about these things, but getting them to go in a self-reflective place where they think about how they talk about it, is really important. And I know that's a big sort of reason why you're doing the project that you're doing.
Trying to map trends in how arguments
actually
move and change.
Yeah, so maybe the next podcast we can do is talking more about that idea in general.
Of course.
So it'll be good. Yeah.
Thank you, buddy. Well, this was a really great one.
This was a good one. Yeah, man. Absolutely.
Yeah, and
thanks for that crash course in history too. I appreciate that. Now I have a better idea now. Absolutely.
It's a pity we didn't even get into. We didn't talk about the Bible or attract
the
Jewish people through history, but that's okay. That's
okay. That's a longer one too.
That would have stretched the minutes even further. So, why don't you ask me the final question?
Yeah, man. So, with this issue of Israel and Palestine, and more sort of precisely how to talk and communicate about this particular issue, where do you want to see in the future?
So, it's such a huge, debate.
Yeah.
And at this point, it's been a couple of years since. This freaking virus, man. It's hard to meet people.
No, it definitely is. Yeah.
But. It's been a couple of years since I've sat down and had another good chat about it.
Right.
I feel like I've had some good talks about it over the years.
Totally.
It's been a bit of a dry spell the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
I really, Jewish identity, the Jewish community fascinates me.
Yeah.
So many. It's one of the reasons I've spent so much time arguing about this is because it just seems to be a real well of just remarkable, capable, and just engaged, intelligent people.
Yeah.
And I love those people, man. That's great.
No, absolutely.
I'm always looking for more people like that.
And we were growing up surrounded in high school with that Jewish intellectual tradition.
And with a very good subsection of that.
Exactly. So we were around a lot of really smart Jewish young kids from really, some of them extremely prominent Jewish intellectual families.
Totally.
Shout out to you, Eli, and others. So that kind of Jewish intellectual tradition is a very rich and storied one.
Yeah.
So it's important because this is an issue that a lot of our friends and peers and people we interact with care about. So want to make sure we have productive conversations with them is really key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd just like to engage with that more in the future and
totally
have the opportunity to maybe sit down in real life and have a real chat.
Bring your map with you, Yeah,
Conversation
combo map.
Most of it's up here. Maybe someday I'll turn it into the paper.
Maybe exactly.
Anything you want
to? So I guess in the future for me, I want to learn more about the history of it, and particular kind of, Israel has fascinated me because. You have this huge discrepancy in terms of rights and individual human rights of people, but Israel as well is doing really interesting work with desalinization and other sort of tech-based ideas around climate change in a region that really needs to think about, changing climates and how resources like water get conserved and things like that.
Super paranoid about that. Vaccination,
exactly. Yeah. So has always been something that's been really interesting to me. And I also just a lot of on the agricultural side of things in Canada here, there's a big kind of Jewish contingent of people who focus on Judaism and agriculture, and having a just in the way a lot of Christian religious people focus on how their religion can help them have a particular relationship with the environment. Jewish people have the same kind of stream in their tradition too, in particular in Canada. So I'm always interested in kind of learning more about that.
Totally, buddy.
Especially since my faith comes out of their faith, right? So directly. Yeah. So it's a good idea to sort of just have that interfaith dialogue going forward, which is so important.
Of course, buddy. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
This was good. All right, so we'll stop it there.
Stop it. No.
Stop it. There we go.